and we are delighted to welcome Thomas Daly, the author of the wonderful book Perilous Times, a book I described as BBC's Merlin on heroin. Welcome, Thomas. Thank you very much for giving us your time. We really
No, it's my
appreciate
pleasure.
it. Um,
After an introduction like that and a description like that of my book, I couldn't possibly not make some time to talk to you and the rest of the book club.
Thank you very much. Um, one of the first questions that we've got from the group is, what was the inspiration behind Perilous Times, and how long did it take you to actually write the book?
Well, I remember when I was a teenager doing little drawings of Arthurian knights, often putting them in situations like World War One and World War Two. So that was somewhere at the back of my mind mm, for a very long time, but I didn't think about actually writing about Arthurian knights until 2016, which was when Brexit happened and Donald Trump got elected, and lots of other things seemed to be going wrong politically, internationally. And I wasn't the only person to have the thought of maybe it's time for King Arthur to fulfill the ancient prophecy and return from Avalon and sort things out, which is obviously something he's supposed to do in times of peril. And I'd had that thought, and I thought it was quite funny. And I saw a few other people on Twitter making jokes along the same lines. But then it very quickly occurred to me that it probably wouldn't be very helpful if King Arthur came back, and that he's a sixth century warlord with a sword that can cut through anything, and that that's not particularly helpful in a sort of complex geopolitical problem like neo-fascism. And it sort of developed from there because I thought there was something inherently funny about that idea. And I tried writing an opening chapter in 2016, which I actually submitted to the British Fantasy Society short story competition. And it didn't get picked for the competition because it wasn't very good. And that was a incentive for me to step away from writing for a while and get into teaching for a few years. And it wasn't until 2019, so 3 years later, that I actually returned to the idea when I was halfway through my creative writing master's degree here at Manchester. And I sat down and returned to it. And this time it had a much more of an emphasis on climate breakdown rather than just the political situation. And I realized it was as much of an ecological book as it was a satirical political book. And that was really the driving engine of the book from then on. And I realized I'd stumbled onto something good. I could write about the climate and the earth and sort of that mythic Arthurian sense of earth magic, and I could tie all of that together. And that's where I came up with the idea for the Knights of the Round Table coming up from underneath trees, which is the sort of defining image of the book, I think. And it's the opening that lots of readers have said that they find the opening very compelling, and that's the thing that drew them in and made them want to read the rest of the book.
Yeah, that I have to say I agree with those readers. That's what drew me in. I mean, I've obviously seen on Twitter, on your Twitter as well, that you put that wonderful thing on where you said you come back from the dead, and the first thing you do, you don't come back from the dead and blow up a fracking site,
Yeah.
which I found incredibly, hilarious. I had to agree. I was like, pretty thing to do coming back from the dead. But obviously, that was kind of how you get introduced to Kay, and obviously the wonderful relationship between him and Marion, which obviously, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, develops and progresses through the book. Um, I mean, in the book itself, we do hear parts from Lancelot, but the two main point of views that we hear from are Kay and Miriam. I'm just
Right.
wondering, did those did the I mean, it's my favorite relationship in the book, and I'm just wondering, did that relationship grow organically, or did you really have to work at it throughout the writing process in the book?
It's a good question. I'm glad it's your favorite relationship in the book. I did have to work very hard on that because, strangely enough, I find writing about mythical creatures and mythological figures a lot easier than writing about real people. And that's one of the reasons why I'm a fantasy novelist. And Marion was a challenge for me. I'd never really written a character like Marion before, so it took me a while to figure her out and get used to her character and decide exactly what her motivations were beyond wanting to save the world from climate change. And it took me a few goes to get her character right and her relationship with Kay right. But I knew that she was fed up with other people trying to fix the problem, and she didn't have much faith in the idea that anyone was going to come along and save the day. And then suddenly Kay arrives, and for a while she's able to think, "Oh, thank God, there's these undead Arthurian knights, and they're going to come along and save the day." But over the course of the book, she finds out it's not quite as simple as that. And I had a lot of fun with their relationship because at first she doesn't fully trust him. And why would you? Because if somebody comes up to you when you're in the middle of blowing up a fracking facility and says, "I'm an undead Arthurian knight. I've got a sword. I can save you from peril," you probably wouldn't believe them at first. So she's incredibly skeptical. But he eventually sort of demonstrates his ability to return from the dead, which is enough evidence for her to believe that there's something supernatural going on. And from then on, she slowly begins to trust him a bit more, and she begins to feel like he's useful and that he can possibly lend his abilities to helping out with her struggle. And I think from Kay's point of view, he's fed up with working for the government. He's returned from the dead before, which is one of the sort of the premise, the conceit of this book is that this is not the first time the knights have returned. They've returned many times before, and he's fed up with doing what he's told, which is why it's quite refreshing for him to meet Mariam and really work for the underdog for once. And I felt like their motivations crossed over there, where they're both fed up and they both see each other as the solution, but they discover gradually that perhaps it's more complicated.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, what I enjoyed about the book is that you explore so many wonderful themes. I mean, obviously, you've already mentioned Brexit, climate change, um, kind of rewild in the natural world as well. Obviously, we get introduced to the god of nature. I'm not even going to try and pronounce his name because I'll get it horribly
I'm not
wrong.
sure how to pronounce it either. I've heard different things from different people. I have friends who are practicing pagans, and they were upset with me for the way I spelled his name in the book. But it's either Konunos or Kanunos or something like that. But I've mashed him together with Herne the Hunter, who's a much later Victorian myth. Because I think more people are familiar with at least the name Herne the Hunter, even if they don't know much about his legend. So yeah, I enjoyed putting him in the book, and having a talking god is always fun.
Yeah, I really enjoyed those scenes. I won't go into detail because obviously I don't want to give any spoilers away, but the imagery was absolutely fantastic. So I just wanted to
Thank you.
let you know that. Um, Obviously the Arthurian legend is is so ingrained in British culture and in the British mind, and we've had so many different versions of the Arthur legend. I mean, I've already mentioned one, BBC's Merlin, which I have to say is my favorite.
I'm a big fan as well.
Yeah, my favorite TV one so far. Thoroughly enjoy it. I've watched the series many times. But with yours, how did you make sure that you came up with a fresh perspective for these so well-known characters?
I think it's sort of impossible to come up with a fresh perspective. And I quite like what Tracy Dion said in her article about this, that all Arthurian fiction is fan fiction. And it's not original. It's playing with characters who everybody already vaguely knows about. Even if you've never read any Arthurian fiction before, you know the name King Arthur, Lancelot, Merlin, at least. And you might know about the love story between Lancelot and Guinevere. And if you've watched BBC's Merlin or even The Sword in the Stone, Disney film from the 60s that lots of people grew up
Yeah,
watching, including me, you know a few more characters like Kay, perhaps, or Bedivere. And we all have this vague sense of these familiar characters, and they're all somewhere in our collective cultural subconscious, which is why it's fun to return to them, I think. And it's why I really enjoy reading other people's Arthurian retellings, because you see these characters and you think, oh, it's them. And there's a joy in giving them more emotional depth than they were allowed to have in previous versions of the legend, which is pretty much how fan fiction works. That people write about their favorite TV characters or whatever, and give them a lot more depth and allow them to have emotional relationships, which they perhaps didn't have in the show. And Merlin's a good example because obviously there's a massive community of slash fiction writers who want to take that homoerotic relationship between Arthur and Merlin and make it explicitly homosexual. And, I think that's great. I think it's wonderful that people take these stories into their own hands. But that's pretty much what I'm doing and what other Arthurian retellings are doing is just having fun in this Arthurian sandbox and, really playing with the legend and writing from a point of view of knowing that some people won't be intimately familiar with the legend. And so having to make sure that the books are still accessible to those readers, but also putting a few little Easter eggs and jokes in there for people who are intimately familiar with the legend. I really enjoyed reading Jez Battis's retelling The Winter Nights, which came out earlier this year, I think, which is so clever in the way that it brings back the characters in a way where there's just these little hints that if you're familiar with the legend, you know exactly immediately who's who. But if you're not familiar with it, it would be a much more interesting sort of, you learn slowly over time who these characters represent. And I think that's part of the fun, really. I had a bit of fun with one of my characters, and I don't want to spoil it, but somebody in this book is masquerading as somebody else, and I enjoyed leaving little clues here and there that the reader might
Yeah,
get it before the big reveal happens.
yeah, yeah. They are one of my favorite characters as well. But as we say, we will not discuss that because it will give a lot of way on the story. Um, I mean, what I would like to ask you as well, what was the most difficult period of your writing this book? Was there a point where you thought, I'm just never going to get this finished? I'm never going to get it to a stage where I'm happy with it and it's going to get published? And when you did have those periods, what made you keep going? What motivated you to say, I'm gonna get this story finished?
All the time, all the way through. I felt that way, and I think it's really important that authors are honest and upfront about this stuff because it's an incredibly lonely profession and it's incredibly difficult. And some people have the idea of authors sort of just leisurely lounging around all the time and occasionally scribbling something down, but all the writers I know work really hard and find it really psychologically difficult to get through a book. And that's was certainly my experience. Particularly those first sort of 3 years where I'd had the idea, but I didn't really know how to execute it. I found that very difficult because I knew it was a good idea. I knew the premise was good, but I just couldn't quite execute it the way I wanted to. I couldn't find the right voice. I couldn't find the right protagonist, the right viewpoint characters, and the right themes for it. So I kept coming back to it and thinking there's something in this, but just feeling like I was falling short and I couldn't quite reach it yet. And that's because I wasn't a good enough writer and I had to go away and work on other projects and develop my craft before I could come back to it and think, yes, actually, I'm ready to write this now. But then, even then, during the process, there were times where I gave up on the whole thing and wanted to throw my laptop into a canal and really just, oh well, I'm not enjoying this. I'll write something else. But really, it wasn't because I wasn't enjoying it or was because it was a bad book. It was because I had challenges and I hadn't figured out how to overcome those challenges yet. Um, there was a big long period in the middle where there was a character and I thought I had to kill this character halfway through the book in order for the plot to proceed. And then I realized that actually they didn't have to die. They could just walk away. They could just not be present in the story anymore. And that could say quite a lot about their character if they did just give up and walk away. And so that's the sort of thing that you can't quickly sort of cheat your way around that. You have to sit and think about it, which I think is a very important part of the writing process. Is giving yourself time to let your ideas percolate. And, that was during lockdown as well. So I was in the position where before lockdown happened, I was living with housemates in Manchester. And halfway through lockdown, I moved back in with my parents because I wasn't enjoying being sort of stuck in Manchester with my housemates when the pandemic started. So I ended up moving back in with mum and dad, and that meant I would have a bit more peace and quiet. But it also meant I was walking the dog and living under the same roof with my parents and getting frustrated with them while I was writing the book. So it had its pros and cons. Um, But being able to go out in the morning and walk the dog whilst thinking about the book was good for my writing. It was a lot better than it would have been if I'd just been sat indoors all the time. And I think that was a sort of a difficult period in terms of feeling very isolated. And now I'm in part of a big thriving sort of support network of other writers who live in Manchester, and we do a lot of writing together in the Central Library. But at the time, I was very isolated, and that was quite difficult because if I had a problem, I didn't really have anyone to turn to. I just had to figure it out for myself. And that's before we even get into the editing, which is my least favorite part of the whole process. But it is difficult. It's difficult work. I'm very dismissive of anyone who writes off writing as just sort of a leisurely pursuit. I think it's a very difficult job. I don't know why anybody volunteers to do it, but we all decide at the age of 14 that we want to be the next J.K. Rowling, I think, and then we realize that it's we've bitten off more than we could chew.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I do some writing as well. So, and people say to me, I'm crazy. What makes you do it? And I completely
Yeah,
agree. I think you do have to be a little bit insane to say that you're going to sit down and do some
absolutely.
and do some
And
stuff.
actually, the second part of your question, you asked me what helps me get through it. I think that's very important advice to share with other writers. And for me, I found out that if I set myself word count targets, if I put every week, I tried to write 4,000 words, and if I just wrote that on the calendar on the Friday, the sort of 4,000, 8,000, 12,000, and just kept going. I was setting myself these flexible weekly targets, and that really, really helped because even when I felt like, oh, I'm writing absolute bollocks today, this is terrible, it really helped me to, well, I'll just keep going because I'm trying to hit my word count. And then as soon as I had hit the word count, I could relax and think, oh, well, I've done lots of work this week. And being able to measure your success like that is really important, I think.
Brilliant. I think I'll do that. I think that would help me massively. So thank you very much for that. Um, One question that I always like to ask authors is, what do you wish you'd known about the publishing industry that you know now that you didn't know before you were published?
Great question. I'm wondering what I can say without getting in trouble with my publishers. It's the really interesting thing about the industry is that it's a bit like getting your first book published as a debut author is a bit like having a tour of Willy Wonka's chocolate factory, I think, because it's like, okay, now we're in the editing room and you find out how editing works. But nobody explains what happens after that until you leave the editing room and get into the copy editing room or into the publicity room, and you learn as you go. Or at least I did, because nobody bothered to explain it to me until we were sort of in that room on the assembly line. It's a fascinating process watching a book go from start to finish. And you do have some input once it's been sold to the publishers, obviously, because you've got to do your edits. But there are some things that you just don't have any control over. I've been quite lucky. I had a lot of control over what the cover looked like and that sort of thing. I think the biggest piece of advice for me would be think very carefully about what you're selling when you sell the rights to your book. And whilst a 2 book deal or a 3 book deal might sound like the stuff that dreams are made of, you sort of have to ask yourself at that point, do I actually have another book lined up? Do I want to sell a book that I haven't written yet? Is that going to give away too much creative control? Because I've certainly found that writing my second book has been uh, an interesting process. I'll put it that way. Because I signed a 2 book deal when I sold Perilous Times, and the second book is still ongoing. And I think I'm allowed to say that I've been in a few little disagreements with my publishers, mostly my US publishers, over what book 2 should look like, which I've found very frustrating. So I would encourage writers who are on the cusp of getting published to think very carefully about the deal they're signing up for. Because even if it's a lot of money, sometimes it's better to just sell what you've written and not sell hypothetical book that hasn't been written yet.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's really interesting to hear. I mean, I've not heard that answer before, so that's great advice. And I'm sure anyone who is on the verge of, querying and things like that, that's a brilliant piece of advice. So thank you very much for that one. Um, I'm just wondering as well, who who are your influences? I know most people usually say, you know, J.R. Tolkien or someone like that. You know, what was kind of the gateway for you into the fantasy genre?
Terry Pratchett.
Okay.
It's the first answer I always give to that question because I um, spent my teenage years borrowing Terry Pratchett books from the school library and sitting in the library and laughing out loud while other people were out playing football or whatever. And he was my introduction to fantasy uh, in lots of ways. His writing taught me so much. A lot about world building, a lot about humor, and a lot about how you can still make very serious points very eloquently whilst making people laugh and telling a funny book and telling a funny story. I mean, and my writing is my mentor figure, Beth Underdown, who I owe everything to. She says that my writing is funny, but wearing a serious backpack. And I think that's exactly what Terry Pratchett did as well. I think I probably picked that up from him. Um, just this beautiful balance between humor and serious satire that I think all sort of anyone who's trying to write funny satirical fantasy fiction should um, try and emulate. And I think I was at a convention over the weekend. I was on a panel about funny fantasy, light and laughter. It was called at FantasyCon in Birmingham, and almost everybody on the panel cited Terry Pratchett as their main influence. But also Douglas Adams. I mean, I remember listening to the original BBC radiophonic audio version of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy when I was about 11 or 12 and lying on the lawn in the back garden of my grandparents' house and listening to that on an old cassette tape and just giggling out loud to myself. But there are sort of more serious influences as well, I think. And I the reason that Perilous Times is in not first person. See, I always get these things confused, and I have a master's degree in creative writing, so I hope that gives hope to other people as well. It's in present tense because I read Wolf Hall and the Cromwell books by Hilary Mantel, and there's something about the immediacy of her prose and the way she's able to move back and forth between past and present tense that really stuck with me after I read them. And when I started writing Perilous Times, I think the original document I was writing in was called something like Thoughtful Draft because it was based on Hilary Mantel's writing style. And I realized that it was perfect because it was basically a marriage between Terry Pratchett and Hilary Mantel. And I was able to use her sort of command of the present tense to um, talk about the sort of the present that the knights were stuck in, but also the past that they remembered, and they've been through over 1,000 years of history. They've been in lots of different wars. They come back from the dead over and over again. So there's so much in the past, and being able to go into past tense to talk about that, and then come back into present tense to talk about the stuff that's happening in the moment in the book was really really useful. So combining Terry Pratchett's humor and Mantel's prose style was just something went like that, and I was able to keep going and eventually finish the first draft.
Good, good. I'm pleased you finished. I'm pleased because
Me too.
it.
I was very pleased when I wrote the end at the end of it, as I'm sure you can imagine. It felt like I'd just given birth or something, which is something that male novelists say all the time, and we really shouldn't because we don't know what it's like to give birth. I'm sure it pales in comparison, but it was a huge relief when I finished it.
Yeah, I can imagine it. I have to say, it's one of my favorite books of the year.
Thank you very much.
I keep telling when people say, "What would you recommend if you were going to read and I just say you have to check out Perilous Times. It's
Thank you.
brilliant."
That's very kind.
Um, Here's a bit of a throw question, but
Yep.
I want to ask it because it's from a friend of mine who was brilliant, Fiona Sharp. She's known as the book extraordinaire from Waterstones, Durham.
Right.
And what she asks is if you were going to go into a bookshop
Yep.
and these were going to be the last three books that you were ever going to read in your
Ooh.
life, and they have to be available in the shop on that day,
Yep.
what three would you pick and why?
Wow. Okay. I think it would be Guards by Terry Pratchett, Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel, and the first book in the Aubrey Maturin Master and Commander series by Patrick O'Brien. I think it would have to be those three. And the reason why is that because I love all three of them very much, and I've reread them more than probably any other book. And I think if you combine those three books together, you pretty much have everything in there that you need to know about life and human emotions, and all the rest of it, world history. Um, I keep coming back to the Aubrey Maturin books over and over again, and there's 20 and a half books in that series, but I've read them through several times because they're not just because they're great historical fiction, but because they're the sort of breadth of human emotion contained within those books, going through sort of parenthood and grief and success and failure and despair and victory. It's a really fascinating series, and I think it's more than any other historical fiction I've read. It doesn't feel like fiction. It feels like you're looking through a little keyhole into the past, and that's actually what it was like. So I recommend them to anybody who enjoys historical fiction. And Guard, just because it's funny, and there's lots of arguments about which is the best book in the Discworld series, and people have different opinions. I also really enjoy the Witches series, and Going Postal is very good, but I think Guards is the one I always come back to because I think that's the first one I read on somebody else's advice. And I would probably suggest that if anybody's never read the Discworld books before, they should start with Guards as well.
Okay. Three excellent choices. So thank you very much for that. Fiona will be
I hope
delighted
Fiona
because
approves.
yeah, because normally people are pretty much stumped because she drops it on them when they come to do a signing or our book group. So well answered there, Thomas. Well done.
Thank you.
I don't want to give too much away here, but the transformation of the character of Lancelot in the book
Yes,
um, is extremely enjoyable.
thank
Um,
you.
Obviously, in the book, you go up. I don't think it would be wrong to say that you go away from the kind of legend of Lancelot, and show us a totally different side to him that I
Mm.
found unique and original and really kept me engaged. Because obviously you see Lancelot as this person that betrays Arthur and things like that. Um, was that a nice thing for you to do? A bit of a relief to go away from that and explore other aspects of his life that isn't in the legends?
Yes, it was. I think I try and write him in a way where it's still conceivable that it's the same Lancelot that we're familiar with from the legends, but there's a lot about him that we don't know, and there's a lot about the legends that he would sort of say, well, that didn't happen, or it didn't happen like that. And my Lancelot's gay, which is revealed in chapter 2, so I don't feel like it's a huge spoiler. Um, and he really became the emotional heart of the book, I think, while I was writing it. And lots of people who've read it say that Lancelot's their favorite character and that his character arc is one of their favorite things about the book, which is very gratifying. And he completely surprised me. I didn't expect him to be such an emotionally important character. I thought he was going to be the cool anti-hero, which he is, but he also has this incredibly tragic and beautiful emotional arc that I wasn't expecting when I started writing his scenes. And I really put him through the ringer. He doesn't have a nice time. um, but he really surprised me, and I'm quite proud of that storyline. And I keep coming back to him in other projects and sort of when I look at sort of writing prequels and sequels, Lancelot's very central to those storylines. And I have a very clear image in my head of which actors I would like to play which characters, but Lancelot's very elusive for me, and he's his own character. He doesn't look like anyone I've met in real life, and I think that's partly because I've got such a sort of strong sense of what he looks like and who he is. as a character. And yeah, I'm very proud of that storyline, and it was lovely to be able to depart slightly from the legend whilst still trying to keep true to the essential bare bones of it. Um, and to and to be able to diversify the book and get away from the sort of heteronormativity of the original legends. Lancelot is sort of, obviously in the original legends, he loves Guinevere, and that's pretty much his defining character trait. But he also has a very close relationship with Galahad in the original legends, and I didn't make that up. Galahad in the original legends dies of grief when Lancelot runs away with Guinevere, and I depart from that slightly. But I think obviously Galahad was very much in love with Lancelot in the original legends, and when people sometimes criticize if you try and diversify myth, they come along and say, well, that's not very realistic. But those people haven't actually read the original mythos, if you ask me, because when you go back and read it, it is very queer and surprisingly racially diverse. And that's not just true for Arthurian, and that's true for Greek myth and all sorts of other things as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, I mean, was there a part of you that was a little bit worried about making Lancelot obviously gay? Like you say, in the original legends, his defining characteristic is that he's in love with Guinevere, and obviously when you do change characters so dramatically, was there any part of you that did worry? I mean, for me, I think it's brilliant. I think you've really represented that community so wonderfully.
Thank
Um,
you.
I mean, I'm not from that community, but I'm an ally, and I think a lot of my gay friends would agree. And he is my favorite character. I really do
Thank you.
enjoy it. So, I mean, yeah, like I said, was there any part of you that was afraid that you could offend a few people, um, when you were reading the
No,
book?
not really. I wasn't afraid. Um, I don't think I was writing anything too controversial, really. That I wasn't afraid that I was going to end up like Salman Rushdie or anything. Because partly because the fantasy is already very queer. There's lots of queer fantasy books coming out, and I think I didn't think I was rocking the boat too much by doing that. I was vaguely aware that people enjoy reading queer retellings of myth, and I knew that it would be well received by the fantasy community. I was slightly worried about some of the sort of more racial claims I was making, because obviously Kay, my main character, is black, and that's based on the fact that post-Roman Britain was a very diverse place. The Roman Empire was very diverse. People moved from one side of the empire to the other all the time. And we know from archaeological records that there were people living in what's now the UK who weren't originally born here, or who were originally born here, but their parents weren't. There's always been immigration, even in medieval Europe. We sometimes get the wrong impression and think that it was a sort of more ethnically homogenous country than it was, I think. Um, so I was slightly worried that people would, bigots would take offense at the idea of a black Arthurian knight. But first of all, there are black Arthurian knights in the original mythos. There's Palamedes and Sagramor and Saphir and lots of others who are described as being Saracens or coming from Babylon. So I very much doubt that they were Caucasian. Um, but yeah, I was slightly worried about pissing people off, but kind of that people like that, I kind of wanted to piss them off. I wasn't worried about it. I was, there are some people who I was trying to piss off with this book, and I'm not sure if I have succeeded. I haven't really had any backlash. I don't read my reviews on Goodreads. Other people have told me that there's a few reviews along the lines of "wokeness gone mad," historically inaccurate, making the pastel modern and gay, and that's gratifying. I'm glad that people like that are getting angry with this book. But I wasn't worried at any point. It's much more dangerous for uh, authors who are women and authors who are black and authors who are gay to write books like this than it is for me to write books like this.
I have to say, I'm pleased that you wanted to piss certain people off, because that's the impression that I got. as I was reading it, and I punched the air a few times, I have to say, saying, well done, Thomas. My thoughts exactly
Thank
on
you
the
very much.
subject. So I thoroughly enjoyed that. Um, here's another one that I always like to ask. Um,
Yeah.
you're hosting a dinner party,
Yeah.
and you can invite only three people. They can be either alive or dead from
Ooh,
any period in history. Who are you inviting and why?
wow. I'd like to invite King Arthur just to find out if he was real or not. And if he was real, what kind of person he was. Was he an enlightened Christian warrior hero, or was he just some sort of pagan warlord? Because that's the answer. That's the question that all Arthurian retellings have to answer that question one way or the other. And of course, if I'm inviting King Arthur, I'd be tempted to invite Merlin and Lancelot and Kay and all the others, but I feel like I should think more carefully before I invite three Arthurian people. Um, I would love to invite Terry Pratchett. I'm very sad that Terry passed away before I got into any kind of professional state where I might be able to casually meet him at a convention and have a drink with him, because he had a huge influence on me as a writer, and I'd love to, you know, talk to him even for 5 minutes. Um, who else? Who else would I talk to if I could talk to anyone from history? Hmm. So many options. I feel like it would be really interesting to talk to somebody like, I don't know. I imagine Horatio Nelson would be a very good dinner guest, but we know a lot about him anyway because we still have his papers and his correspondence, and he lived in the early modern period. So we can sort of construct his personality based on documentary evidence. So maybe it would be a waste to invite him. Maybe I should invite someone who we want to know more about. I feel like my historian friends would prefer me to invite someone a bit more sort of distant in history, like I don't know, Cleopatra or Attila the Hun, just so I could interview them and write down the answers and give them to historians to improve our kind of knowledge of the past. I think I'd feel honor bound to invite somebody like that.
Yeah, that'd be brilliant, wouldn't it? To be able to go back and speak to those people who we haven't got as many documents on and as information on, and fill the gaps, which would be
Absolutely.
which would be excellent. Um, Another question that I always like to ask, which current authors are really grabbing your attention at the moment? Um,
That's a
who would
great question.
who would you recommend? Who would you say go to a bookshop, buy these books, buy these authors, you'll have a great time?
I'm reading a book right now called Shagidi by an author called Wole Talabi, which is just so much fun. It's hilarious. And it actually got sent to me by the guys at Orion Books, which I'm very grateful for because they wanted me to read it and give them something to put on the blurb. Um, it's very, very funny. It's very, very clever. It's about African nightmare gods who tried to team up to steal something from the British Museum, or rather steal something back from the British Museum. Um, and it's very, very, it goes all over the place, and you never know what the next chapter is going to be about. So suddenly it will cut to um, Alistair Crowley on an expedition across the Algerian desert in 1909, and you think, where did this come from? But you're just carried along by it because it's so funny and so immersive. So that's a great book. I'm really enjoying that. Um, for any sort of sci-fi fans, I've been really enjoying it's called The Wayfarer Saga by Becky Chambers. That's sci-fi like I've never seen it done before because it's not about saving the galaxy or anything like that. It's about the everyday problems that people have whilst living in a spacefaring society, and everybody trying to do their best despite sort of confusing cultural communication problems between different species. Um, And I think there ought to be more sci-fi like that, that where the stakes are not we have to stop the Zoltrons from invading and blowing up the galaxy. It's more like, oh, well, the Zoltrons are coming over for dinner, and I don't know whether they use forks or not. You know, that's the stakes in Becky Chambers, and perhaps that's doing her a bit of a disservice because it is more complicated than that. But I really enjoy her stuff, and whenever she has a new book coming out, I'm excited to read it. Oh, and there's a book called The Mars House coming out, I think, in February next year by Natasha Pulley, which I'm really, really excited about. And I have no idea what it's about, apart from the fact that it has genetically engineered mammoths on Mars. And that's enough for me to want to read it. And I know she's a great writer from other stuff I've read from her in the past. So I'm looking forward to that one.
That sounds absolutely fabulous. I'll definitely be checking that out when it comes out. Okay. This might be a tricky question.
I enjoy tricky questions.
If you had to pick one book to read for the rest of your life,
Mm-hmm.
which would it be?
Oh.
Apart from your own, of course.
It would probably be one of the three I mentioned earlier, which is a bit boring of me to repeat myself. But I think if I could only read one book, it would probably have to be Wolf Hall, because there's just something about that book that, like I said, with the Aubrey Maturin books, really, it doesn't feel like you're reading historical fiction. It feels like you've been gifted an insight into the past. It feels like you're actually the fly on the wall in Thomas Cromwell's room. And there's something about the magic of that and the immediacy of it that just carries me along every time. And I always enjoy revisiting those books. And I had to kind of give myself an embargo for a while that I wasn't allowed to read them anymore. I had to read other things because it was too easy to just pick Wolf Hall back up off the shelf and read that again. I sometimes do that if I'm feeling ill or, if it's just over Christmas, if I've got nothing else to read. Um, yeah, I think it would probably have to be Wolf Hall.
Okay, fair enough. That's a fine answer. Not a problem at all. A question from Steve Frost, who is part of our group.
Yep.
He wants to know, because he's enjoyed the book so much, is there going to be a sequel? Are we going to see the Arthurian Knights again? I understand if you can't say anything, but
No, I
if you
can. I
can,
think I'm
that
allowed to talk about it now. There's going to be a prequel, in fact, which there wasn't originally going to be. This was Perilous Times was intended to be a standalone novel, and I had vague ideas about telling short stories about the knights and what they'd been doing throughout history over time. But I didn't intend to come back to it quite as quickly as this. But eventually, my editors convinced me to write a prequel. So that's what I'm working on at the moment. I can't say too much about it, but it's set before Perilous Times. It has most of the same characters cropping up in it again, and a few new ones as well, because my UK editor, Jenny, was very, very keen to meet the other knights who don't appear in Perilous Times. And I'm having so much fun with the other knights. Agravain is a horrible, terrible human being, but he's my favorite character because he's very funny. And Tristan is just one of those men who can't get over his ex, and he's just hung up on his old. Even though all of the other knights are just saying, "Let it go, mate. Just stop bothering her." But and we all know a man like that. I think who needs to stop being such a sap and get his act together. I've been that man on occasion,
we've all
and
been there.
yeah, I'm really enjoying this prequel and getting to know the other knights and having fun with it. I hope everybody else enjoys it when it comes out.
Brilliant. So my final question, let's say that the fantasy genre didn't exist. So
Yep.
it's not around, but you obviously still want to write. Which genre would you go into, and why?
I love that question. I've always fancied historical crime. I think that's such a great genre because it's the mashing together two genres that I absolutely love. And Umberto Eco did it the best in The Name of the Rose, which is Sherlock Holmes, but at a medieval monastery. And then obviously Ellis Peters came along with the Cadfael books. And ever since then, there's been this huge explosion of Roman Empire murder mysteries, and somebody even wrote a sealed cave mystery, which is a caveman thing where I haven't read it, but it's a great idea where Ugg has to figure out who killed Grog, and I think that's so it's so wonderful, kind of taking the tropes of crime fiction but moving them to a really interesting new setting like the Renaissance or World War II or whatever. I'd love to have
Have,
a crack at that.
have you? I don't know if you've heard of him, but have you read an author called Abir Mukherjee? Have you come across him?
I've heard of them. I've not read any of their work.
He's absolutely fabulous. He writes historical crime, and it's based in 1920s Calcutta in India. And
Excellent.
he gives a totally different view on the British right over there. There's 5 books in the series. It starts with The Rising Man, but if I was going to recommend any historical crime, it would be Abir, or it would be Vasim Khan as well. They both write some brilliant historical crime.
Fantastic. I'll have to look that up. That sounds great. That sounds really up my street.
Yeah, you'll definitely enjoy it. Okay, thank you ever so much for your time, Thomas.
Oh,
This
my
has been
pleasure.
this has been a fabulous interview. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. I hope you have as well.
I certainly
Um,
have.
and I'm really looking forward to our group watching it and other people as well when we get it out there. I
Thank
will
you.
let you know once it's out there. I'll share it with you on Twitter and everything else. But
Wonderful.
thanks.
Just before we go, I wanted to say how much I like the sound of your group. I think having a book group that's dedicated to getting men to read more is a really worthy goal, because obviously it is sort of fantasy fans do predominantly tend to be non-male, and I think getting more men to read generally is a wonderful initiative, because we have such a problem of there's an epidemic of male mental health problems in this country. And I've certainly been on the receiving end of that. I've struggled with my mental health and with feeling very isolated and depressed in the past. And reading books has been really one of the big solutions to that for me, meeting other people who also enjoy books, writers, readers. So I just think it's a wonderful initiative, and I'm glad I could come along and talk to your group, and I hope it thrives and that you connect with lots of new members.
Thank you very much. It is our aim. Um, like I mean, obviously we want as many men to join, and I'm the same boat as you. I've suffered with my mental health, so reading is my way of keeping healthy and looking after myself. And like I always say, book people are the best people. Um,
Absolutely.
you can't beat a good book. And I tell everyone I can to read as much as possible because it does make you feel better. So thank you so much for that praise. And we
You're
hope
very welcome.
that we can get a few more authors to join us. And hopefully, when your new book club comes out, maybe we can have a return and we can discuss that as well, if that would be okay with you.
Absolutely. I'd love to. Look forward to it.
Okay. Thank you once again, Thomas. Um, I'm going to stop the recording now. But thank you again, and thank you so much for Perilous Times. It was an absolute joy, and it probably is my top book of the year so far. So thank you very much for it.
Oh, you're very welcome. That makes me very happy.